dust tasted like old bones, not the kind I dissected for weeks, the brittle, dry skeletons of Dust Bowl refugees, but the thick, gritty residue clinging to every surface of this collapsed observatory. My fingers, raw from sifting through decades of decaying ledgers and brittle paper, scraped against the cold, damp stone floor of the archive's lower chamber. The wind howled outside, a constant metallic rasp against the broken panes, carrying the briny stench of distant salt flats mixed with the sour decay of rotting paper and forgotten things. My lantern cast frantic, jumping shadows on the water-stained walls, illuminating piles of moldy ledgers where the ink bled like old blood. I was tired, so tired of the dead, their silent accusations echoing in the hollows of my own bones. Then, my boot caught on something half-buried beneath a collapsed shelf. Not stone, but metal, cold, smooth, and unnaturally heavy. I knelt, brushing away the grime, revealing a tarnished locket, its surface etched with faded, intricate patterns. My gloved thumb flicked it open. Inside, a small portrait stared back. The face was blurred by time, but the limbs were wrong, long, spindly, stretching beyond the frame, and the eyes too large, too dark, seeming to swallow the tiny canvas. A wave of profound disorientation washed over me, the familiar scent of the dead suddenly sharp, cloying. Why would someone paint this? Why, the question was a whisper against the wind scraping. I lifted the locket closer, the tarnish flaking like dead skin under my touch. The wind shifted, howling through a jagged hole in the roof, carrying the distant, rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of metal dragging across concrete. It was a sound that didn't belong here, not in this tomb of dust. My breath hitched, fuffique scrape. Scrape. It wasn't the wind. It was closer. I turned lantern light, swinging wildly, illuminating the towering shelves. Nothing, just dust motes dancing in the weak beam. Then, a coldness traced a path down my neck, sharp and precise. Like icy fingers tracing a secret pattern on my skin. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. Not the wind, not the cold. Something else. The sensation lingered, a phantom touch that made the hair on my arms stand rigid. The storm clouds outside deepened, bleeding into bruised purple and black, swallowing the last of the weak daylight. The lantern's flame guttered violently, casting the room into a deeper, more suffocating gloom. The scrape, scrape, scrape grew louder, sharper, seeming to come from the very walls now, a relentless metallic whisper against the stone. The briny decay scent intensified, thick enough to taste. I fumbled for the lantern's wick, my fingers trembling. The wind, or whatever was scraping, seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a soft, final tissue, the lantern flame died. Not a snap, but a sigh. Like molasses pouring out of a jar. Absolute blackness. The scrape, scrape, scrape didn't stop. It just waited. The cold fingers were gone, but the sound remained, echoing in the crushing dark. A sound that felt like the scrape of a key turning in a lock that had never been opened. The wind extinguished her lantern, leaving only the scraping sound echoing in the black. The blackness pressed in, a physical weight. The scraping hadn't ceased, but it felt deliberate now. Not random, but methodical, as if something were testing the boundaries of the silence. I fumbled for my lighter, the metallic click a jarring intrusion against the relentless scrape. Scrape, scrape. A meager flame bloomed, casting a sickly yellow circle around my face, revealing nothing but the oppressive closeness of the shelves. The scent of brine and decay was almost unbearable, clinging to the back of my throat like a shroud. My fingers brushed against something rough, a spine, a book. I pulled it free, the leather brittle and cracked, leaving a residue of dust on my gloves. The title, embossed in faded gold lettering, swam into focus, Fugging Luminous Pathologies. The lettering felt oddly, warm against my cold skin. Another scrape, closer this time, a rasp against the stone floor just beyond the lantern's reach. Fury coiled in my gut, a familiar response to the suffocating weight of the past. Silas Thorne. The name echoed in my mind, dredged up from the ledgers I'd sifted through. The founder. The one who'd built this mausoleum to silence. I found a small table, its surface slick with moisture, and laid the book open. The pages were filled with meticulous script, diagrams of swirling auras, and observations on the emotional resonance of the displaced families who'd sought refuge in the Dust Bowl. Thorne's words were clinical, detached, describing fear, grief, and despair as quantifiable phenomena. Aural studies E. He'd treated human suffering like a scientific specimen. The scrape, scrape, scrape intensified, a rhythmic pulse in the darkness. I ignored it, focusing on the text, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. Another book, then another. The library was a labyrinth of brine-stained leather and decaying paper, each volume a testament to Thorne's obsession. The air grew colder, the scent of decay thicker. I felt a prickling on my skin, a sensation like static electricity. My lighter flame flickered, threatened to die. I leaned closer to the pages, desperate for a rational explanation, a logical thread to unravel this madness. Then it happened. As my fingers brushed against the spine of a particularly thick volume, a coldness seized my wrist. Not a sudden shock, but a slow, creeping chill that spread up my arm, leaving gooseflesh in its wake. I looked down, expecting to see frost, but there was nothing. Just the faint glow of the lighter illuminating the lines on my hand. The scraping stopped. The silence was absolute, suffocating. I raised my head slowly, the lighter trembling in my hand. The shadows seemed to deepen, to coalesce into a form. A figure, tall and gaunt, woven from dust and shadow, its features indistinct. It stood behind a towering shelf, partially obscured by the gloom, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unwavering, fixed on me. The scent of decay intensified, overwhelming, almost nauseating. The figure shifted, and I saw them hollow sockets where eyes should have been. My breath hitched in my throat. A whisper, dry as parchment, slithered through the silence. "You were always catalogued." My fingers jammed between the shelves, the rough leather of the books digging into my skin. The scraping resumed, not from the floor this time, but from the shadows themselves, a chorus of metallic whispers that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The journal lay open, its pages yellowed like the bones of something long dead. My fingers traced the inked margins, Thorne's meticulous handwriting, each word a nail in the coffin of my own sanity. The scraping had grown louder, a rhythmic scrape that gnawed at my nerves. I didn't look up, I didn't breathe then. Something, a vibration beneath my feet, not the floorboards settling, not the wind, something turned. I crouched, pressing my palm to the warped wood. The grain felt slick, almost twin-wrong, as if the planks had been varnished with something viscous. A loose edge, a jagged split. My gloved fingers hooked beneath it, pried. The board resisted, then gave way with a wet tear, the sound of fabric rending in slow motion. The passage beneath yawned open, a maw of darkness, but not the suffocating black of the library. This was different, cooler, sharper, like the inside of a refrigerator door left ajar for too long. I didn't hesitate. I dropped into the hole, my boots striking concrete with a hollow thud. The drop was shallow, just enough to send dust swirling in the dim light filtering through the cracks above. The air smelled different here, less of brine, more of rust and old motor oil. The passage sloped downward, the walls slick with condensation, the scent of whetstone clinging to my throat. The kitten whine, there perched on the edge of the hole, its tiny body trembling. Its fur was the color of storm clouds, its eyes too large, too knowing. It didn't mewl, just watched. I followed the slope, my fingers dragging along the wall. The texture was uneven, pocked with grooves as if something had been dragged through here. Something with claws or no, not claws. Fingers. Long, skeletal fingers, scraping. The passage opened into a stairwell. The steps were uneven, worn smooth by decades of use, the concrete jagged at the edges like broken teeth. I descended slowly, each step groaning under my weight. The air grew thicker, the scent of brine creeping back in, mingling with the metallic tang of the stairs. At the bottom, another door, wooden this time, warped with age, the paint flaking in great peeling sheets. I pressed my ear against it. Silence, no scraping, no whispering, just the drip-drip of water, distant, rhythmic. I turned the handle. It didn't budge. Then, with a grunt, it gave way, swinging inward with a creak that sounded like a dying breath. Beyond the door, the world was different. The wind howled, a low, mournful wail that carried the scent of salt and decay. The street stretched out before me, a labyrinth of crumbling buildings, their facades peeling like sunburned skin. The dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the faint light of a dying sun, casting everything in a sickly storm-gray hue. The kitten darted ahead, its tiny paws kicking up clouds of grit. I pocketed the spectacles, found them in the passage, resting on a ledge like they'd been waiting. The glass was cold, unnaturally so. I slipped them on. The world, twin-shifted, colors bled together, the outlines of everything sharp and jagged. The kitten's aura pulsed around it, a storm cloud of dark energy, swirling and churning like a hurricane trapped in a jar. My breath hitched. The spectacle's lenses distorted the air, the world warping at the edges, as if I were looking through water that had just been stirred. Molasses pouring NTD1. The sound filled my head, thick and slow, a memory I couldn't place. The kitten's aura flickered, darkening, and I stumbled back, my boot catching on the uneven step. The fall was sharp, the concrete biting into my knee, tearing through the fabric of my pants. Pain flared bright and white-hot, but I didn't cry out. I didn't move. The scraping started again, not from the passage, not from the walls. From Subendurveth. The concrete bit into my palms as I pushed myself up, each breath a jagged thing in my throat. The scraping, scrape, 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 wasn't above me anymore. It was still behind me, the sound of metal dragged across stone, precise, deliberate, like a surgeon's scalpel testing its edge. My fingers curled into the rough surface, nails splitting as I hauled myself to my feet. The air smelled different now, sharper, the brine thick with the acrid tang of ozone, like a storm about to break. I turned. The observatory wasn't there. The walls were still wood, still warped, but the layout had twisted like a dream half remembered. The corridor stretched ahead, but not straight, it coiled, the edges of the floorboards peeling up like the skin of a rotten apple. A door stood at the end, its frame sagging, the paint blistered and blackened, as if scorched from within. The brass plaque read Thorne's Oral Clinic in letters so faded they looked etched into the wood itself. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I didn't move. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then, click, a lock turning, not from the door ahead, from behind me. I whirled. The passage had shifted again. The way back was gone. In its place, a heavy door of dark oak, its surface carved with strange looping symbols, stood where the wall had been. The kitten slunk into view, its tiny body trembling, its storm-gray fur standing on end. Its eyes Godou. Its eyes reflected the same swirling aura I'd seen through the spectacles, dark and pulsing like a bruise. I didn't breathe. The door behind me groaned, the hinges rusted but still strong. It swung open, slow, deliberate, as if pulled by unseen hands. The scraping resumed, louder now, the sound of 1,000 needles dragged across glass. The kitten hissed, a sound so low it vibrated in my bones. Then he stood in the doorway, Thorne. His coat was the same, the fabric worn at the cuffs, the buttons blackened as if singed. His hands were elongated, fingers too long, too thin, the knuckles pressing into the sleeves like he was trying to shrink into himself. His eyes, God, his eyes, were the same, too wide, too knowing, but they weren't focused on me. They were fixed on the kitten, his lips parting in a smile that wasn't a smile, just a stretch of skin over too many teeth. "Ah," he said, his voice a whisper, a breath against my neck. "You're back." I didn't answer. My fingers twitched toward the spectacles in my pocket, but I didn't pull them out. I didn't need them. The aura around him was there, thick and dark, a storm cloud pressed against the glass of his skin. His hand lifted, a gesture toward the door ahead. "Come," he said. "The clinic is ready." I didn't move. The door behind me slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. The lock clicked. The scraping stopped. The kitten darted forward, its tiny paws kicking up dust as it slunk past Thorne's legs. He didn't look down. He just stood there, waiting. I exhaled, slow, controlled. Then I stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound swallowed by the thick air. The door to Thorne's Oral Clinic loomed ahead, its surface warped, the brass handle tarnished green with age. I reached for it. My fingers brushed the cold metal. The door swung open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something older, something like rust and old blood. The walls were lined with glass jars, their contents preserved in a murky liquid, the shapes inside too long, too thin, too foramen. Scalpels gleamed in the dim light, their blades curved and sharp, arranged like the ribs of some great beast. The kitten yowled, a sound like a blade being dragged across bone, and vanished into the shadows. I stepped inside, the door slammed behind me. The scraping started again, scrape, scrape, louder now, closer, the sound of a blade being drawn against stone, and then a hand, skeletal and cold, pressed against my back. The walls here were papered in yellowed sheets of what might have once been medical diagrams. Veins, arteries, the skeletal outline of a body stretched too thin, its limbs elongated like thorns. The air smelled of carbolic acid and something older, something like whetstone and the copper tang of old blood. My fingers twitched toward the spectacles in my pocket, but I didn't pull them out. I didn't need them to know what was in this room. I started at the far end, where the light slanted through a grimy window, casting long shadows across the floor. The scraping had begun again, a slow, rhythmic scrape, 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 that vibrated through the soles of my boots, through the bones of my feet, up my legs until it hummed in my teeth. My hands shook as I reached for the first file, the leather binding cracked with age. The pages inside were filled with neat, precise handwriting, replacement protocols for displaced emotional signatures. My stomach twisted. The words blurred, but I forced myself to read. Subject exhibits residual trauma from prior displacement. Aura indicates residual fear. Swirling violet concentrated in the temporal lobes. Administer sedative to stabilize. Proceed with extraction. I slammed the folder shut. The scraping intensified. The sound now a chorus of blades dragging across stone, filling the room, drowning out my breath. My pulse hammered in my throat. I turned. The kitten was there, perched on the edge of a gurney, its storm-gray fur bristling, its violet eyes fixed on me. The aura around it pulsed, thick and dark, like ink spreading in water. I swallowed hard. The spectacles burned in my pocket. I didn't need them. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze, the pressure of something unseen pressing against my skin. I moved to the next file. The pages were stained, the ink smeared as if written in haste. Subject exhibits accelerated decay and emotional baseline. Aura instability, anxiety, clinging to walls, fear pooling in corners. Fear pooling in corners, my fingers dug into the paper. The words made no sense. None of it made sense. I was the one who should be writing these notes, not Thorne, not some ghost who had been dead for decades. The scraping was louder now, a cacophony of metal against metal, the sound filling my skull, making it impossible to think. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the noise didn't fade. It seeped feet through my fingers, into my bones, until I could feel it vibrating in my teeth, in the back of my throat. I whirled around. The door was gone. In its place, the walls pulsed, the paper peeling away in great ragged strips, revealing something dark and glistening beneath. The scraping was everywhere now, the sound of 1,000 blades being drawn against 1,000 surfaces, the noise so overwhelming it made my vision swim. I staggered back, my heel catching on something sharp. The kitten hissed, a sound like a blade being dragged across glass, and vanished into the shadows. I didn't breathe. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then, click. A lock turning, not from the door. From the walls themselves, the paper peeled back further, revealing a corridor, dark and narrow, the floorboards warped and rotting. The scraping started again, louder, closer, the sound of something dragging itself toward me through the darkness. I didn't move. The walls pulsed. The paper tore away in great, ragged strips, revealing the truth beneath. The walls were alive. The scraping was the sound of something moving inside them, something cold and hungry, something that had been waiting for me. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. The kitten's violet eyes gleamed in the darkness, its aura pulsing, throbbing like a heartbeat. I turned to run. The corridor was already there, the door already open, the scraping already filling the air. I didn't hesitate. I ran. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, the sound swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. The scraping followed me, a relentless rhythmic scrape, 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 that vibrated through the soles of my boots, through the bones of my feet, up my legs until it hummed in my teeth. The walls pulsed around me, the paper peeling away, revealing the truth. I was trapped. The scraping was deafening now, the sound of something dragging itself through the walls, through the floorboards, through the very air itself. I could feel it, the icy fingers tracing patterns on my skin, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the back of my neck. The kitten was there, its violet aura pulsing, throbbing like a heartbeat. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I ran. The spectacles burned against my palm, the weight of them a brand. I didn't hesitate. The glass was cold against my skin, the edges sharp as broken teeth. The world blurred, then sharpened, aura first and. The storm-gray haze of the kitten's fur pulsed violet, thick as oil slicks, and I followed it like a wound following a blade. The corridor twisted, the walls breathing. The air smelled of brine and rust, of ink left to rot in forgotten drawers. The scraping started again, a slow, deliberate scritch against the concrete floor, like fingernails dragging down a chalkboard. But deeper, older, the sound of something gnawing through centuries. The kitten darted ahead, its tiny body a flicker of movement in the gloom. I clenched my jaw. The auras around me were a storm of their own swirls of bruised purple, sickly green, the color of old bruises. Sorrow, dread. Fear. I moved faster. The scraping followed, a mocking echo, as if something was mimicking my steps, dragging itself just out of sight. The kitten paused at a door, its back arched, fur standing on end. The aura around it flared, a storm cloud pressing against the glass of the spectacles. I reached for the knob, cold, slick as a dead man's hand. The door groaned open. The room was a tomb of photographs. They lined the walls, rows of faces staring back at me, their elongated limbs stretched too thin, their eyes too large, too knowing. The scraping intensified, a chorus of blades being honed, the sound vibrating in my ribs. I swallowed hard. The kitten's aura pulsed to beacon in the dark. I stepped forward. The first photograph was a woman, her smile too wide, her fingers too long, curling like thorns. The next was a man, his eyes hollow, his limbs twisted as if he'd been stretched on a rack. The scraping was louder now, the sound of something dragging itself closer, closer, the air thick with the scent of wet stone and copper. I didn't look away. The kitten moved to the far wall, its tiny paws clicking against the floorboards. The aura around it was a storm, a living thing pressing against the glass of the spectacles. I followed, my boots scuffing against the concrete. The scraping was everywhere, the sound of 1,000 blades being drawn, the noise making my teeth ache. The last photograph was different. It was me. My face stared back at me, my limbs elongated, my eyes too large, too empty. The scraping stopped. The kitten hissed, a sound like a blade being dragged across glass, and vanished into the shadows. The photograph fluttered, the corners curling like dying leaves. The scraping started again, louder, closer, the sound of something dragging itself toward me through the darkness. I didn't breathe. The photograph fell. The scraping was deafening now, the sound of something dragging itself through the walls, through the floorboards, through the very air itself. I could feel it, the icy fingers tracing patterns on my skin, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the back of my neck. The kitten was there, its violet aura pulsing, throbbing like a heartbeat. The spectral librarian flickered into view, its form a storm of static, its eyes two pinpricks of darkness in the gloom. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The scraping was everywhere. The photograph was on the floor, the image of me staring back at me, my limbs too long, my eyes too empty. The scraping was louder now, the sound of something dragging itself closer, closer, the air thick with the scent of brine and decay. I didn't move. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then, clicky, a lock turning. Not from the door, from the walls themselves. The paper peeled back further, revealing a corridor, dark and narrow, the floorboards warped and rotting. The scraping started again, louder, closer, the sound of something dragging itself toward me through the darkness. I didn't breathe. The walls pulsed. The paper tore away in great, ragged strips, revealing the truth beneath. The walls were alive. The scraping was the sound of something moving inside them, something cold and hungry, something that had been waiting for me. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. The kitten's violet eyes gleamed in the darkness. I turned to run. The corridor was already there, the door already open, the scraping already filling the air. I didn't hesitate. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, the sound swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. The scraping followed me, a relentless, rhythmic scrape, 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 scrape that vibrated through the soles of my boots, through the bones of my feet, up my legs until it hummed in my teeth. The walls pulsed around me, the paper peeling away, revealing the truth. I was trapped. The scraping was deafening now, the sound of something dragging itself through the walls, through the floorboards, through the very air itself. I could feel it, the icy fingers tracing patterns on my skin, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the back of my neck. The kitten was there, its violet aura pulsing, throbbing like a heartbeat. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I ran. The photograph fluttered in the darkness, the image of me staring back at me, my limbs too long, my eyes too empty. The scraping was everywhere. The scraping was everywhere. The photograph fluttered in the darkness, the image of me staring back at me, my limbs too long, my eyes too empty. The scraping was everywhere. It wasn't just in the walls now. It resonated in my skull, a dull, persistent throb that threatened to split my teeth. Fury coiled in my gut, a venomous serpent striking against bone, ferroplaced, and the word echoed, a mocking pronouncement in the oppressive silence. The spectral librarian's whisper, dry as dust and brittle as bone, clawed at my sanity. You sought to understand a stand fear ver, but you fear Fiedribeim. Replaced a D, the words weren't spoken so much as implanted word, a cold brand on my consciousness. It was a truth I'd desperately avoided, a shadow I'd chased away with the sterile logic of pathology now. It bloomed in the darkness, a poisonous flower. I lunged, a desperate, futile gesture. I wanted to scream, to shatter the suffocating stillness, to obliterate the librarian's spectral form. My hand connected with something solid, something fragile. A glass jar filled with what looked like preserved insects. They tumbled to the floor, a sickening footish splat, and a chorus of tiny brittle clicks as they broke. The smell hit me then, a cloying sweetness overlaid with the sharp tang of formaldehyde. Molasses pouring thick, slow, agonizingly viscous sifties seemed to drip from the air, coating my skin, my lungs. The librarian didn't react. It simply fifistoved, its pinprick eyes gleaming with an unsettling amusement. Then, the auras. They surged, a wave of bruised purple and sickly green coalescing into a shimmering cage around me. I slammed against the wall, the impact jarring the breath from my lungs. The paper peeled back further, revealing the pulsing organic texture beneath. It felt alive. Panic flared, hot and blinding. I pushed, straining against the invisible barrier, but it held firm. My muscles burned, my vision blurred. The kitten watched, its violet eyes reflecting the spectral librarian's amusement. It didn't flee, didn't offer any semblance of comfort. It was a witness, a silent participant in my unraveling. The scraping resumed, louder than before, now accompanied by a low, guttural hum that vibrated in my bones. It wasn't just the walls, it was the floor, the ceiling, the very air itself. It was Sunday everything. The molasses scent intensified, thick and suffocating, clinging to the back of my throat. I tasted rust, felt the grit of dust between my teeth. My mind fractured. Fragments of memories surfaced: defunct childhood birthday party, a failed autopsy, a whispered conversation with a colleague. Each memory distorted, warped, overlaid with the image of my elongated limbs, my empty eyes, the mocking smile of the woman in the first photograph. They were everywhere. They were in the memories, in the walls, in the air I breathed. I wanted to beg, to plead for release, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by the rising tide of despair. The librarian's form began to shift, to coalesce, to fangro. Its shadow stretched across the room, a vast, consuming darkness that swallowed the light. It wasn't a shadow of a person, it was a shadow of something else, something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent. The kitten's aura flared, a blinding pulse of violet light. It wasn't a beacon anymore, it was a predator's gaze, a silent promise. I was trapped, not just within the walls of this grotesque observatory, but within the confines of my own fear. The realization was a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole the last vestiges of my defiance. I could feel my resolve crumbling, my identity dissolving. I could only watch. The librarian's shadow stretched further, encompassing the kitten. It didn't touch it, didn't speak to it. It simply absorbed it. The violet aura winked out, leaving only an oppressive darkness in its wake. The scraping intensified, a triumphant chorus that resonated deep within my soul. I didn't breathe. The scraping died, not with a whimper, but with a food sigh, a final exhalation of rusted metal against concrete, grinding itself into silence. My breath hitched, a reflex, like my body had been braced for the sound for years. The air thickened, not with the cloying molasses, but with something lighter, salty, brittle, like the wind off the Gulf in the dead of winter. It carried the scent of brine and the ghost of dust, fine as talcum, clinging to the back of my throat. My fingers twitched. The jar's shards were still warm beneath my knees, the formaldehyde's sweet rot curling into the edges of my vision. Then, Ilera, not the girl I'd known, all sun-bleached hair and laughter, but her face superimposed over the spectral librarian's, a grotesque fusion of childhood and decay. The librarian's lips didn't move, but her voice slithered into my skull anyway, a whisper so intimate it might as well have been my own thoughts. "Thorne, you remember her now, don't you?" The words coiled around the memory like ivy, choking it before it could take root. Ilera's hand, small and freckled, reaching for mine as we stood on the edge of the old well behind her house. "Tavi Genevieve, don't look down." But I had. The darkness below wasn't just darkness, it was foundry. The scraping had been her voice all along, a child's giggle stretched thin, warped by the years. The kitten's aura flared, a pulse of violet so violent it made my teeth ache. It wasn't watching me anymore. It was twin-waiting, fochin for D. The air hummed a low electric thrum that vibrated in my ribs. My hands flew to my temples. No, not hands. Clawsive. The nails were too long, too sharp, digging crescents into my flesh. Blood welled dark and slow, dripping onto the floor. The scent of copper mingled with the brine, thick and metallic. I gasped, and the world twin shifted. The observatory wasn't a room anymore. It was a hallway, narrow and lined with photographs. My childhood photographs. Me at 3, grinning into the camera, my front teeth missing. Me at 12, arms crossed, eyes flat with something I couldn't name then. Fear, maybe, or the first stirrings of a knowing. Me at 20, standing in a morgue, my face gaunt, my hand steady as I held the scalpel. The glass was unbroken. The images didn't move. But the air twindeed. It rippled, like heat off pavement, and the laughter started again, Ilera's high and bright, echoing from the end of the hall. "You can't hide, Genevieve, not here." The diary entry was beneath my fingers before I realized I'd moved. The page was yellowed, the ink smudged as if written in haste. The replacement is perfect when the target believes they've escaped. The handwriting wasn't mine, it was Alara's. Or it was the librarian's, or both. The words blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. A stuttering film reel of my own mind unraveling. The scraping was back, but softer now, like fingers dragging across a chalkboard. Not from the walls, from Sivincidi, my skull. The door at the end of the hall creaked open. No, not a door. A foot-mouth darkness yawned beyond it, vast and toothless, and the kitten's aura pulsed once more. A final, desperate warning. The laughter stopped. The photographs stopped breathing. The molasses scent returned thicker now, clinging to my skin like syrup. I could taste it, rich and suffocating, coating my tongue. The librarian's voice, smooth as oil, slid into the silence. You were always the one who noticed. Not a question, a statement, the truth. The door mouth closed, and then the scraping began again. The photographs burned, not with fire, never fire, but with the slow, creeping heat of a brand pressed to skin. My fingers hovered over the glass, the edges of the frames biting into my palms. The child in them wasn't me, not really. She was a stranger with my face, her eyes too wide, her smile too sharp, like a blade held just below the ribs. The molasses scent coiled tighter, thick as a noose, and I could twin feel. Its syrupy fingers tracing the nape of my neck, the base of my skull. The scraping wasn't sound anymore. It was sifty pressure, grinding into my bones, a rusted hinge in the marrow. The kitten's aura flared again, not violet this time. 15. A pulse so violent, it made my vision swim. The color bled into the edges of the photographs, the frames warping like wet paper. The child's face in the first one, 3 years old, grinning, her features stretched, her mouth splitting into a grin too wide for a human skull. The glass fogged, then cracked, spiderwebs of fracture spreading from the corners. The kitten's eyes gleamed, irises swelling, elongating like taffy pulled too thin. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It just twitched, and the air between us thickened, sticky as the molasses, pressing down on my lungs. I exhaled, and the sound was wet, choked. The librarian was gone. Not vanished, unmatite. Her shadow dissolved into the darkness at the end of the hall, leaving only the kitten. It moved, not a pad of its paws, but a fun drag, like something much larger pulling itself forward. The distortion started at its head, ears too long, stretching like wax, dripping from the tips. Its body followed, limbs elongating, the fur parting into a shimmering membrane. Not fur, but fur-skin stretched, too thin over bone. The aura pulsed again, crimson bleeding into the walls, the photographs, the very air. The scraping wasn't in my head anymore. It was signed everywhere, vibrating through the floor, the walls, my teeth. My skull felt like it would split open, the sound crawling out through the cracks. The molasses pouring started slow, a distant drip, a single thread of syrup unspooling from a jar. Then another, then 100. The sound built, a crescendo of thick, slow falls, each one louder, heavier, until the hall was drowning in it. The photographs melted, the glass running like water, the images bleeding into the molasses, faces dissolving into the syrup. The kitten's form kept stretching, its body unraveling, not into a monster, but into footy nothing, just a writhing mass of crimson aura, a pulse of color that swallowed the whole hole. I didn't scream. Screaming was for people who still believed in sound. The molasses filled my mouth, thick and sweet, and I tasted copper, the metallic bite of blood where my claws and my nails had dug into my temples. The scraping wasn't a sound anymore. It was a footy weight pressing into my bones, grinding through the marrow, through the muscle. My vision blurred, the crimson aura swallowing the edges of my sight, the kitten's form dissolving into the color, into the molasses, into the scraping that was now inside me, inside my bones. I collapsed. The impact wasn't on the floor. It was on something else, something soft, something soft, something toenail alive. The molasses poured over me, thick and slow, and the scraping became a roar, a sound that wasn't in the air but in my blood, in my veins, in the marrow of my bones. The last thing I saw was the kitten's aura, crimson and pulsing, and then the world went dark. Not darkness, not silence. The scraping, always the scraping. Corridors unspooled behind me like wet paper, edges curling inward as I stumbled. The storm cloud palette bled into everything. The walls bruised with gray, the floor a slick, leaden sheen, the air thick with the scent of ozone and forgotten rain. No molasses drip, no scraping, Just silence pressing against my eardrums, thick as wet wool swallowing every footfall before it could echo. I pressed my palms flat against the cold stone wall, feeling the faint vibration of the building itself, a slow, deep thrum I'd never noticed before. It wasn't sound. It was the absence of sound, a vacuum that pulled at my teeth. My own breath rasped too loud in the stillness, a harsh, dry sound that felt like betrayal. I turned a corner and the hallway stretched into a new shape, longer, narrower, the ceiling lowering until I had to duck. My reflection in a smudged window showed a stranger, eyes too wide, jaw too sharp, the skin around her mouth stretched thin like old parchment. I touched my face. The skin felt cold, alien. Not me, I thought, but the thought dissolved in the silence. The kitten's aura pulsed in the periphery of every reflection, a crimson lightning bolt in a bruised sky. It wasn't watching me. It was watching the foot imprisoned hen. The observatory wasn't a building. It was a cage built from my own fear. Every corridor rearranged to mirror the dread I'd buried, the fear of being replaced, of the stranger in the photographs finally stepping into my skin. I'd spent years dissecting others' deaths, cataloging trauma in sterile labs, never realizing the true horror was the slow, silent unmaking of your own identity. The silence wasn't empty. It was stiffened waiting. It was the sound of my bones settling into a new shape, a shape that fit the photographs perfectly. I stopped at a door. It was the same door I'd passed 10 minutes ago, the one with the cracked handle. Now it was a window, looking out onto a storm cloud sky that pressed against the glass. Beyond the glass, the kitten stood on a ledge, its tiny body blurred by the rain-streaked pane. Its aura flared crimson, jagged, a perfect storm. The light from the storm cloud reflected in its eyes, making them glow like embers in a dying fire. I reached for the window, fingers trembling. The glass felt cold, alive, humming with the same thrum as the walls. I pressed my palm against it, and for a second I saw through the glass, not rain but 1,000 other corridors, all leading to the same place, all showing me the stranger with my face. The realization crystallized like ice in my throat. Fear, this is the cage, not the observatory. The fear, the replacement. The silence deepened, becoming a physical weight in my chest, crushing the air from my lungs. I could feel the molasses absence like a phantom limb, the sticky sweetness replaced by the metallic tang of my own blood copper, from where I'd bitten my lip. My nails dug into my palms, leaving crescents of red in the cold skin. The kitten's gaze locked onto mine through the window. No movement, no sound. Just that crimson pulse, the storm cloud in its irises. The wall behind it began to ripple, not like water, but like smoke coiling into shape. The storm cloud palette bled into the stone, swirling, thickening. The kitten's form dissolved into the color, becoming the storm itself. I didn't step back. I didn't scream. I just watched as the wall flowed toward me, a wave of bruised gray and crimson, swallowing the window, swallowing the corridor, swallowing the silence. The last thing I saw was the kitten's eyes, 2 points of light in the storm, before the wall closed over me. The last sound was the absence of sound, the silence pressing in from all sides, and then the world dissolved into storm clouds.